Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, and I don't know, good day somewhere else. We have Michelle and Ignace in Asia, and I'm in Berkeley. Physically, I'm in Berkeley, but mentally, I'm there with you. I'm in Asia. Our governor here in California, Gavin Newsom, yesterday sadly just dimmed the lights of the indoor dining rooms, sadly. But I'm supportive of that. You know, that's the least little bit we can do to combat COVID-19. But this really, really makes me miss the places you have. I wish I could be holding a glass of champagne, you know, walking around in the Hutong, squat next to those statues, next to your hotel, Ignace.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about. Or on the Bund, on the terrace with a beautiful view of the river with you, Michelle.
Yes, yeah, I'm not there either.
Oh, I know. It's so sad. And so yesterday I tweeted out, well, I WeChatted my friends and asked for a couple of memories from my friends of dining at your places. And I just wanted to show you a few. The pictures flooded in. So you will see. Let me share my screen. It's kind of, it's really lovely. Can you see? This is a group of friends, very recent, I think Mother's Day, also Mother's Day, beautiful mothers. And this is, I think a little while ago in the evening with you in Beijing at the Hutong TRB. This is another friend celebrating. These are some older pictures of friends going to capital M or M on the Bund. And your food, the famous croissant, right? So just lovely, like friends all just send photos. I'm going to stop the sharing so I can continue talking. My point of showing those images is to say, capital M, M on the Bund, TRB, your establishments are really part of our collective institutional memory of China, of living in China. It's really lovely. I can't tell you so how excited I am to have Michelle Garnaut, Ignace Lecleir. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Two highly successful entrepreneurs join us today at WildChina On Air Conversations in Zoom. Now I'm going to go through a little bit bio. Michelle is the M for the M restaurants. Right. I've known Michelle for many, many years. She's one of those female entrepreneurs that I truly, truly admire. Not only does she have a golden touch on running restaurants and bars. I mean, the list is long. There's the M at the French in Hong Kong, M on the Bund in Shanghai, Capital M, Glamour Bar, Glam in Shanghai, probably more to come. But besides F&B, she also is very well known among our community as a philanthropic person. She does a lot of work. I know she single-handedly built the Shanghai Book Festival, right? Well, with partners, of course. But in any event, I know she knows the same secret: better wine, better food, better books. I live with someone at home who writes, so I can attest to that. But she also built bathrooms for country girls in the villages, also many other things, mentor walks for entrepreneur women. I don't know how she manages to get food on the table while doing so many other things. Anyway, that's why I want to talk to her. Now, Ignace Lecleir. It's a difficult name to pronounce, I'm sorry. It's a Belgian name, and many of us may not be familiar with this name, but we are very familiar with your products. The TRB restaurants. A lot of us actually knew at the very beginning as the Temple restaurant in the very beginning, right? So Ignace arrived in Beijing just, I think, before Olympics in 2007, was it? To work at Maison Bouloud. And after some success there, he went on to build 5 restaurants. And the newest, Hulu, which is, you can see it behind him, is to open this coming September, right? This is Hulu, not the Netflix competitor. All right. So what an impressive journey. Thank you. Thank you both. It's an honor to have you both. Now I'm going to start first thing first, because many friends have WeChatted me. Which one of your restaurants are open right now? Everyone wants to know. Michelle?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. I only have M on the Bund and Glam, and they're both open. So only Shanghai, and they are both open, but I am actually in Hong Kong.
Okay. You never closed during the past few months.
We always close at Chinese New Year. We were closed for about 3 weeks. That's all. Yeah.
Terrific. So all of us can still go back. Well, those of us in the US now.
Good.
Ignace, in your restaurants?
Yeah, on my side, most of the restaurants are open. So 4 of the 5 restaurants are open. Just the main restaurant, TRB Hutong, is still closed at the moment. Just waiting for the authorities to allow us to reopen again.
When do you think that will open, the Hutong?
I think most likely ends of July, probably beginning of August. That's what I'm hoping for.
Wonderful, wonderful. When the trees are so green, lovely. Now I'm gonna go all the way back to the origin story. I always love the origin story. How did it all start? All right, Michelle, I'm gonna start with you because M on the Bun was probably the first fine dining restaurant I ever went to in China many, many, many years ago. I think most of our audience here have been to your restaurant, but just for those who may not have, this is probably the most, it was and still is the most upscale fine dining restaurant along Shanghai's waterfront, the Bund. It opened in 1999, right? So I assume, Michelle, you would have started preparation back in 96, 97 and to get business going. And at that time, Shanghai didn't have the glitzy skyline, anything. Why did you choose?
No, it didn't. Actually, where to start? I first went to Shanghai in the 80s. I loved Shanghai. It was one of those cities, and I'm sure everyone will have some city they've been to that they just love instantly, like something about the place. And in about the mid-90s, when things were sort of changing in Hong Kong, I had a restaurant in Hong Kong open in 1989. When that was all happening, it seemed to me that, and this is maybe rather contentious at the moment, it seemed that China was really the future for all of us. And it was a question of like, okay, if that's the future, let's embrace it. Let's go, let's do it. So I started in about the mid-90s to look seriously, and it took about 5 years because we opened at the beginning of 99. And I did a pop-up at the Peace Hotel, which I now claim, of course, is China's first pop-up. So I now claim pioneering pop-ups in China because we did 2 weeks at the Peace Hotel at the end of 1996, which we called M at the Peace, but I called M at the Fringe Goes to Pieces because we were fine in Hong Kong, but I have to say it was, I hope nobody will take any offense to this, but working with a state-owned enterprise, which is the Jinjiang Group, which is now apparently the 2nd or 3rd biggest hotel group in the world. And I know this for a fact, in 1996, they were the 77th biggest hotel group in the world because they told me every day. But I learned a lot about working with, you know, sort of a big organization and decided that I had to be independent. So that was the real, I think that was the real thing then, was actually trying to figure out how to be, you know, sort of how to do it and how to do it independently.
Wow. But back then, why did you choose the Bund? Well, I think there was a Portman already in Jing'an in the French area.
Actually in 96 I was on the Bund, and in 98 I'd spent 97 and half of 98 looking for a space in the FFC, the former French concession, because that was really the heart and center of Shanghai. But in the same way it seemed to me, and I had a couple of people advise me, very key people. One was an architect who'd built in Pudong, Hong Kong guy. And he said, you know, those people who say that nothing's ever going to move in Shanghai are completely wrong. There's a new airport being built in Pudong. At that time, nobody even knew about this airport being built. And also Pudong, you know, at that point, Pudong was considered the sort of empty wasteland of all of this space. And, you know, I mean, it wasn't an empty wasteland. That's a bit of an urban myth. I mean, maybe in the 50s it was rice paddies, but, you know, really by the 90s, you know, 80s and 90s, there were already things on the waterfront. And so I think you could see that Shanghai had to expand, and you know, the central government's plan was to expand Shanghai into a financial center. So they were on track, and you know, good on them, done it.
Visionary. That's
yeah, visionary. Well, you know,
be visionary for you too.
Well, I think in many ways it was courageous, I'll say that, but it was, I think in many ways we're lucky. It was sort of the right time at the right place. Yeah.
Perfect. Now, Ignace, your location is the other way around, right? I think many of us have the experience. For me, going to a restaurant for the first time, I had a car and the car couldn't get through in between the vendors and the bicycles. The hutong was very narrow. So I had to drop the car and get out and hike the last 200 meters with my heels.
Yes.
But once you're there, this oasis, absolutely stunning old temple with contemporary. How did you choose such a location?
Well, for me, it was maybe actually a little bit of a coincidence. I was in Beijing. I came to open a restaurant for the Olympic Games, and then I really enjoyed China. And it was actually really never been my goal to open my own restaurants. But I kind of enjoyed Asia, and I saw the opportunities, and I liked what was going on. So I decided to try to open my own place. And actually, as I was not prepared, Michelle actually was one of my first advisors who really helped me to make the big step. Because I think with many people, when you want to try to become an entrepreneur, you have many doubts and you go back and forth. So I definitely owe Michelle big time for her help with guiding me in the beginning.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
What a success. So proud of you.
I had a good guidance, so thank you so much. So when I was looking in Beijing, I come from Bruges in Belgium, and I think Bruges is a very, very beautiful city. So in Beijing, I was looking for a place that would have some charm and some personality. And then this temple compound or project was presented to me. And actually I found it also by mistake. I used to go running in the hutongs. And as I was passing by, I saw this project. And by coincidence, the landlord who was having this project was looking for somebody, maybe you would say crazy enough to try to open a restaurant in this place. Because as you say, it's a beautiful location. It's also very, very difficult to go to. And if you understand the logistics of Beijing a little bit, with traffic, you have to be very, very motivated to want to go there.
I know Juan,
Yes.
the person who did the conservation and development of the project. He told me they moved 450 trucks of debris out of that place in renovation. So yeah, amazing project. Now, how did you decide to offer Western fine dining, particularly Michelle? I think you were so early. Back then, I remember when I got to Beijing in the early 90s, McDonald's was the standard Western meal. And then how did you see the price range, the palate difference?
Well, I asked it, you know, interestingly, you know, I come from Western cooking background. I cooked myself for 10 years professionally. So, you know, I didn't really need to take Chinese food to China. You know, everybody in China knows much better than I do how to do sort of Asian food. And it was one of my guidelines was actually, we didn't want to do things with Asian influence. We wanted to do very much at that time. There was a real sort of fusion, what was called fusion food was beginning to happen. And I felt very strongly that we should actually be, whatever we were going to do, we had to be authentic in doing it. So for me, there wasn't a question. I wasn't going to go to China and figure out a concept. I mean, I know what I like doing, and I know the standard of food and the type of food that we do. and so for me, that was the range. It was interesting right in the beginning. I sort of made it more simple. Shanghai has a tradition of, because it was such a mixed port city, it has a tradition of many, many different people there. So it has what is in Hong Kong we call Chinglish food, which is sort of Chinese English food. Shanghai was very much influenced by the Russians. So there is this Chinese English sort of cuisine and borscht and chicken Kiev. I mean, people who know Shanghai well, this is sort of quite old fashioned now, will know that those dishes, sort of people recognize those dishes as sort of Chinese Western dishes, which actually are whole variations on Western cooking, you know, in sort of done in a, still a very Western way, but, you know, sort of changed a bit. So I did things like that to begin with. And the funny thing was that actually the local customers, the Chinese customers, basically were really interesting. They said, oh, we can get this sort of thing, you know, at the place down the road, you know, what we want, you know. They ordered the much more M dishes. So actually, it was sort of an interesting move. And in the beginning, it was a bit of trial and error. A lot of people said to me, it doesn't matter where you open, it doesn't matter what you do, the food has to be good and it has to be cheap. And I said, I can tell you, whatever I do in China, it's not going to be cheap. You know, it doesn't need more cheap restaurants. And when we opened, we had nothing over 100 RMB, even the main courses, there was nothing over 100 RMB. And I realized we spent about $1 million US. That was a lot of money in 1998.
Yeah.
You know, that was, and, you know, it was very insecure. So, you know, we had funny discussions with people like the rice, I don't know, Ignace, maybe you never had to deal with the Price Control Bureau, but there used to be the Price Control Bureau, and I'm sure they're still there, but they basically control the price of rice. So they would come in and say to us, you can't charge, you know, 20 RMB for a Coca-Cola or, you know, 15 or whatever it was. You can only charge 3. You know, you were paid 2 and you were only allowed to charge 3. So we had a lot of sort of challenges in the beginning. But, you know, I mean, it was crazy days, but it was great fun also. You know, when I wasn't having a nervous breakdown, we were having good laugh.
Mm-hmm. Now, since you touched on the price already, I was going to ask like my grandmother embarrassing money questions, but now I can ask you, Ignace.
Yeah, you can.
Did it cost you a lot more than $1 million to open your restaurant?
Oh,
7 years later? No, 8 years later, right?
Oh, for myself?
Yes. To open your Hutong.
Yeah, actually, the first restaurant is probably about similar to Michelle. About the
well
$1 million.
Done. Well done, because the prices had gone up a lot.
Yeah, but it was also probably a little bit more smaller, but yeah, I think about $1 million by the time it was finished.
How about now?
Well, I don't open those big restaurants anymore.
Yeah.
I think at the moment, I mean, actually, I don't think it has increased a lot. I think when you open your first restaurant, as a Westerner, I think we always think that a restaurant's going to be there for 20, 30 years. At least that was my mindset. And actually now, as things have changed, actually you start to readjust and maybe realize that restaurants actually, it's also trendy. It might actually only be there for 5 years. So I think you readjust your thinking process, which was one of the biggest things when I came to China, that many restaurants you would go to, you would see that they maybe sometimes like almost taped together, not as refined as we would see them in the West. So not saying that this is the direction that we had. Say again?
Say again, what did you say about many restaurants different
so
from
I
the
think what I was trying to say is in terms of spending of restaurants, I think I try to make restaurants with understanding that actually they might not be there for 30 years or for 20 years, which I think is in the West, when you make a fine dining restaurant, you always think it will be there for quite a long time. You're trying to build an institution, and there's so many examples of that in Europe and in America. Actually, those kind of restaurants in China actually are very hard to find because the trends are moving so fast. Things are always moving. It's also very difficult to get a long-term lease. So In terms of the investment you put into a restaurant, I think it really depends now on the amount of the lease that you can get, how long the lease can be.
Michelle,
I think that's
do you agree? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's very much determined by leases. And, you know, I know in Australia, I don't know much about the American market, you know, sort of the rental or the lease agreements, but I know in Australia that you would never dream of only signing a 5-year lease on something. You would be signing, you know, a lease with increments. Whereas now in China and also Hong Kong, the standard lease, I think now, Ignace, I'm not sure, is at like 2 and 3 years, 5 years max. So, you know, if you've only got 5 years in a business, you know, you really can't be spending, you know, enormous outlay. And that was one of the challenges that we had with Capital M, which was, you know, very beautiful restaurant, remarkable position, but, you know, it was massively overcapitalized. You know, we spent way too much money in the beginning, you know, on it. And actually it was started sort of behind the 8 ball because of that. I mean, after all, the restaurant is a business and it has to make enough, like, you know, they have to make enough money to survive. Otherwise your business doesn't survive.
That's very interesting. You know, in my neighborhood, there's the famous restaurant, Japanese.
Yeah.
Alice
They
Waters.
probably own the building, do they?
They do.
Yeah. I think it's very, also, you know, that's the other challenge in China and in Hong Kong, which is, you know, is the fact that, you know, most people can't ever afford to own a building. You know, the cost of property is astronomical. So, or like, you know, the temple for Ignace and the Bund for me, it's impossible. You can't buy it. It's state owned and it stays that way.
Now, Ignace, you, Michelle earlier mentioned some of the difficulties in working with Chinese authorities or partners. What was your experience? What was the most difficult part of your experience?
I'm laughing. What's the most difficult? Oh my God, let me think.
I'll come to you, Michelle, in a second.
Hang on, I'll start writing a book.
Most difficult for me, I think. So I've worked mainly actually in the States, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. I think the most difficult thing for me was maybe changing the mindset, the way of doing business in China. It's definitely very different. The law changes a lot if you can understand what you're supposed to follow. So I think it's the most challenging part for me is that maybe you consistently feel that maybe you're walking somewhat on thin ice. Things are changing and you're not so certain exactly. You're probably taking a certain amount of risk that maybe you would not take in the West. But then again, I've never really owned a restaurant in the West, but I've managed quite a lot of them. So it's just a very different feeling. Specifically, I personally feel that actually having worked in Europe and in the States, I think that they have similarities in the way certain things are working. It's just, I think here in China, it's just much less clear.
Well, was there a moment when you just thought, this is crazy, I should just bag it and move to San Francisco? Then I would be having a nice restaurant near me. Was there a moment when you thought about quitting?
No, actually, no, not for me. I think there've been some, I actually think probably running as a restaurant in San Francisco right now might actually be more complicated than it is in Asia. I think there's a myth about the complications of doing business here, but actually there is also slightly a little bit more freedom in that way also. So I'm not quite sure if I'm in a losing position or not.
Well, in what way? Do you mean like COVID related? China is a better environment or what?
No, I just feel, for me personally, I think after having worked in the States for quite some time, I feel to open a business, I think is a little bit more easy than it probably would be in different parts of the world. Also, I think running it, yes, there is certain uncertainties, but there's always seems to be a way in China to fix problems.
Interesting. Now, Michelle, what was your experience? The most difficult part?
I'd actually just say to that when, just to sort of, come back to Ignace's point, when we first started in 1999, building through 98, there weren't any really fine dining restaurants. And especially in the Fenghu district, there was nothing. There were restaurants and they were very expensive and, fancy, very well-known Chinese restaurants. There were hotels, but there weren't sort of freestanding, independent, high-end restaurants. So we sort of were rewriting the rule book. And I found that actually the Fenghu district people were extremely helpful. And, occasionally there were things that there was lots you didn't understand, but in many ways, I think China was catching up so quickly that they were actually writing, they were sort of putting things together and refining laws. Of course, there were always fire laws. The hygiene laws in China are extremely strict. And they have been, and they always were on paper extremely strict, but they are now implemented much more. And I think in 99, it was much more difficult for them to implement their very strict hygiene rules. Even the layout of a restaurant, the layout of a kitchen, it's much more strict than Australia. I can tell you, there's no way, that you could get away with sort of open kitchens where customers are that close to fire or to, not firing. So they're strict, they're very strict, but, I understand why. But I think that, that has changed. And I think it's actually now much clearer. There's new things that come in, and they used to, and I'm sure Ignace will remember this, when there was a new rule that came in, it would be retrospective. So there'd be some new rule, and then they'd say, well, that actually applies from last September. You're like, oh my God, so, but, in a way they were just actually, let's say, consolidating and writing a law book for the labor law, for the hygiene law and things like that. So those challenges were always big, and there's always uncertainty in business. I think. I don't really think it matters where you are. I think there's uncertainty in business. I think the biggest challenge for me, I don't know, I think, I'm trying to think there've been so many challenges. Not very long after we opened, about 6 months after we opened, the dodgy landlord who had our building, and they had to get permission because there were no restaurants allowed. So to get permission, they'd actually convinced the district authorities that there had been a canteen in the building because it was an old shipping company building. There'd been a canteen, and therefore we should be allowed to open a restaurant. So they said, okay. And the developers who'd taken this building went bankrupt, and he was arrested for fraud and for like 600 million RMB or something like that. So that was about 6 months after we opened. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Actually, I was in Europe, and somebody called me and said, you have to come back. This has happened. It's on the front page of the papers. I'm like, oh my God. So I got on a plane, went back, and I thought, oh, this is just going to be the end of it. We had we're on the 7th floor, so we had the lift company giving us their bill. We had the electricity company giving us their bill, because there were no other businesses in the building. We were the only business. So they said, if you want to stay in business and you want to stay open, you have to settle all the debts of the bill of the landlord. I was like, are you mad? And what was really interesting was that we got an agent, or whatever you call it, from the High Court, who came in and said, you are to pay your rent to us, and you are to send any creditors, anybody. You don't have to deal with anybody. We will deal with it until you sort out your new lease. And then the Shanghai Shipping Company became our landlords. So we got an extra year thrown into our lease, because that all took a year by the time that happened, actually a year and a half or something. And we started a new lease with the Shanghai Shipping Company on the same terms as the original lease. So my first experience of the sort of legal system really protected us. So that's a really, I tell that story for a very good reason, because I think there's so much distrust, but actually, it was really very helpful. And I wouldn't have known what to do. You know, so but it did work.
I find that very interesting. Is that uniquely Shanghai versus Beijing? Are there geographical differences in
well, there's district differences, you know, because actually in the district you have to, in a lease you have a district court, so you have settlement in a district court. So maybe, but it was a high court in Shanghai, so it was one of the highest courts. Because of course, you know, at that point it was, I think there was a lot of what was fairly minor corruption at the time. And this was quite an interesting story because the guy, I never met him. Luckily for me, I never met him. But he had one company, and the guy who ran the bank on the ground floor, they basically were putting their heads together and coming up with fake companies, borrowing against them, letting them go bankrupt and keeping all the money. So, you know, and then it of course becomes exposed at some point, became exposed. And yeah, that was the end of him. He was jailed. He was not summarily executed. He was jailed. But then we had new landlords. So in many ways, I didn't have to deal with such a big, you know, issue. And it's funny when I think back about the truly nervous times, and Ignace says, you don't know if you're going to be there tomorrow. That for me, and we'd only been open about 6 months, actually not even 5 months or something. I thought, oh my God, it's the end of it already.
Wow. Ignace, do you have anything to add on that?
21 years later, we're still there.
Yeah, 21 years. Ignace, do you have anything to add on that line of experience? Before I move on to talk about food itself.
Yeah, no, I like the story. It's inspiring. No, but I think, yes, I think there's a lot of, I think maybe misconception about China. I think, as said, I think there's always, magically always there seems to be a way that things somewhat work out. So that's always very surprising.
Yeah, I think that's what it is one of the surprising things. There is always a solution.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things about China that's sort of quite interesting. It's like you can argue, and I came in this I don't speak any Chinese. My Chinese is terrible. And that was quite useful at the time because because they thought I didn't understand. But you understand a lot of gestures and the way people are and the way they behave. And of course I was one with the money. So at the end of the day, I'd sort of sit there patiently for an hour. Then I'd have a little screaming hissy fit. And everybody would go, oh no, calm down, calm down, calm down. Because in business in China, you never lose your temper. So I'd do that. And then they'd all like, oh, they didn't know what to do with me. And then they'd concede and I'd say, well, how are we going to find a way through this? And then they'd say, okay, well, let's find a way through it. It's like, good. Okay, let's find a way through it. So, you know, I found it sort of quite easy to, once you've figured out, you know, sort of how to work with everybody, actually, I found it was all fairly straightforward. You know, I mean, everybody's trying to make money in business. No one's sitting there not trying to make money, you know, and my thing at the end was like, okay, boys, you know, it was all men. Okay, boys, you know, let's get this together. I'm the one with the money. I'm the one sitting here bringing the money in. So you either want to do it or you don't. But of course, that's not the position China's in anymore. China's now the second biggest economy in the world. We all know. So, you know, it's a very different position that it's in now. And it's interesting to hear you say, Ignace, that it's still quite, you know, that it's easier maybe to open a restaurant in China than it is in other places. I think the same about friends with restaurants in Australia. I think in many ways, despite the lax hygiene department laws, it's actually in some ways easier to open in China.
I think that will be the biggest surprise a lot of the audience can take away today from this part of the conversation. Now I'm going to move on to actually talk about food. Ignace, when I think about the Temple restaurant, I salivate over that truffle soup. I think a lot of truffle cream soup, was it? You have that as like a staple on the menu, right? So two questions here. One is, how do you decide what to keep as the staple dish on the menu and what to replace? And second question is, how do you source locally? Because I'm from Yunnan. My aunt has given me a truffle that's like the size of a baseball. And where do you get your truffle? Like, how do you source locally? Two questions.
So keeping dishes as staples. actually for us it's very simple. We just listen to our customers. I think it's how we do most of the things in the business. I think as a restaurant, you might have a certain liking for a certain dish yourself. But I think it's most important to actually really listen to what customers say. I always say to the team and the chefs that actually it's not really everything I like in my own restaurant also. And there's quite some things actually that I don't quite like about it. But I've learned over the time by opening different restaurants that actually it's not always about what I might really like. Before I open the restaurant, many people have a dream about only putting on the dishes that they feel very comfortable about or very, very strong about. But yeah, so to answer the question when it comes down to making staple dishes, one is, I think if it's a passion of the chef, if it's something that he feels very strongly about, and also I think like what you just mentioned, if we have lots of customers' feedback that people really say this dish is just really, really amazing. And actually sometimes we are surprised because maybe we just thought that actually this was just maybe not our strongest dish. But with the dish that you mentioned, I completely agree with you. This is a winner. We are very strong behind it. And in terms of finding local ingredients, I think there's amazing ingredients in China. And I think that, again, I think is also something that is not always quite understood. I mean, mushrooms for sure, Yunnan is where we get most of our mushrooms from. We're just about to finish white asparagus season, which actually a couple of years ago, when I first came to China, the quality was not that good, but now this time, every year, the quality just becomes more stronger and better. Many actually of our foreign customers who are very familiar with white asparagus from France or from different parts of Europe, when we tell them this is actually it's a local product, people are just really astonished that it is so close as what they used to in their home country. So ingredients, I think, in China is not that difficult to source. In my restaurants, as a first strategy, we try to source everything as local as possible. And then if it's something that we really feel we cannot find, then we will try to go to different surrounding countries.
Very interesting. Now, Michelle, as I was preparing this list of questions last night, I looked up on your menu and I saw M's crispy suckling pig. And it was such a mistake because it was like midnight. It made me so hungry. I find that's a really good example of what you said earlier, the fusion. How do you balance, like crispy suckling pig is a very Chinese concept, but all the other,
not yes,
the term is familiar to Chinese, but then you have flavors and a lot of other things that are non-Chinese. So how do you strike a balance between anything to do with Chinese or completely introduce a new flavor or cuisine?
Well, you use first of all, you use what's there. And I'd just like to back up Ignace. It's absolutely true. There is excellent produce. And of course, you have to use good suppliers and reliable suppliers and people you know where the supply is coming from, who are taking their profession of supplying you seriously. So, and now there's a lot of organic produce, even though it might not be registered organic, but we know farmers in Beijing also. Quite interesting, there's different produce between Beijing and Shanghai. And I found when we went to Beijing, it was really interesting. There was so much more in different foods, like cherries, fantastic cherries in Beijing, which you don't get in Shanghai. So interesting, yeah. So even China in its own, as a sort of closed market, you don't get things from one city to another. That's quite interesting. I mean, we get mushrooms and truffles from Yunnan, but we use what is locally available. We use Australian or European meat. So we use beef and lamb from Australia and New Zealand. Chickens. Actually, our little pigs come from a farm in Anhui, a tiny little farm. We know the farm. So, we take sourcing very seriously, of course. So you basically, when I still write the menus with the chef and you're really sort of trying to find a balance. So I like, we've got standard dishes that have been there for years. And like, I actually don't eat beef at all. So if I had my way, there wouldn't be beef on the menu. But let me tell you, it is the biggest seller on the menu.
Why?
So
why would you not have beef on your menu?
Well, I don't eat it, you know, sort of. So, but that's irrelevant. You know, it's irrelevant what I eat. Although I would never put anything on the menu that I really didn't like. If I thought, no, this dish is just not good enough, then it's not going on. But you know, we've had the only dish we've had truly on our menu for that many years. I mean, crispy suckling pig, which is very, very famous in Spain and France and, you know, Portugal and other places too, is actually been on our menu since the 90s in Hong Kong. So, and a lot of things have. We have the lamb dish that's been there. And we used to have customers who come in on a Saturday night at 9:30, having waited an hour for a table, and there was no lamb left because it takes 5 hours to cook. And they'd throw a hissy fit and go home. You know, so, you know, you sort of got to balance all of that out. But the only dish I was going to say that's been there the whole time since we opened, which is a funny sort of story, is pavlova. And I actually sort of have this joke and say on my tombstone, it should really be written, she took pavlova to the world, because nobody had actually ever heard of pavlova outside Australia or New Zealand until we opened in Hong Kong. And serving pavlova was a bit like, you know, one of those fancy New York restaurants giving you a chocolate brownie. You know, it was sort of so homemade and like down market. But I placated my business partner by saying, okay, we'll put it on the menu. Anyway, 31 years after that happened, it's still on the menu. But I actually personally don't really like it. So there.
I can't say I'm a big fan.
But everybody else does, let me tell you.
Now, interesting that you still spend time writing the menu.
Yeah,
Ignace, you can tell me in a second, but I can tell you a funny story. Like reading Western menu is a nightmare for Chinese, a nightmare. Like seriously, like when I first came to the US, whenever it's time the menu comes into my hand, I get really nervous. Like I don't know if this is a hot dish, a cold dish, what portion it comes in, what order it should come in. Yeah. And I was too embarrassed to ask. Yeah. And so I would suffer through whatever I've ordered, right? Now, for example, the dish that you have, the suckling pig with braised fennel and pork loin crepinette, and sweet peas and apple horseradish gremolata. I have to look up those two words.
Okay. But and what is it Chinese? Because actually in Chinese, I know, I mean, of course, I find that impossible to know what it says in Chinese, but actually I have a friend who's a writer and she actually looks over, we translate, you know, I get our Mandy, who has worked with us for 21 years, she translates the menus and then this other friend looks over them and says, yes, that's good, and then tries to put a little bit of a twist of
you want to know from a diner's perspective. Yeah. I know all the Chinese words, but I don't know what they mean.
Oh, okay.
I know I can recognize all the Chinese characters, but together I have no idea what they mean either. And so how do you decide to write a menu? Now I'm totally fine. If I don't understand something, I just ask the waiter. Like, how do you decide how to write it? I've noticed a TRB's menu is very straightforward, like just the ingredients. You don't even talk about how it's cooked or whatever. And how do you educate your staff and your client about through this difficult process?
Yeah, I think
what do you do?
Yeah, for the menu for me and TRB, actually, we try to give us actually as little information as possible. For the reasons that you just mentioned, we try to use English words, no French terms, and try to keep it as matter as a fact as possible. I think it maybe takes away a little bit of the romance, the mystique of reading a menu, which I think Michelle is saying. I think it's nice to refer to certain words that, you know, it's nice to read it. When you just give words, which I think is a trend that's been in New York for quite some time over the last couple of years. So we went a little bit in the same direction. So the menu, it just gives you 4 or 5 words, and we try to keep it as straightforward and simple as possible. actually one of my my more casual restaurant called Hulu. We actually have the menu with pictures, which is the first time I've ever done a Western restaurant with a picture menu, like a Chinese restaurant. And actually it makes ordering much more easier for our customers, and definitely also for our wait staff. But in fine dining, we have not made that step yet, and I'm not quite sure if we're ever going to go there. But in a casual restaurant, I think it's, even actually for myself, when I go to a Chinese restaurant, I do kind of like flipping through the pictures, and just makes things much more easier.
We've had the same discussion, Ignace. It's like, oh my God, do we go to the picture menu? Oh.
Yeah, well, it's actually, I was surprised. It's very complicated to have a picture menu. It takes a lot of time. And once the picture is set, it has to be identical as the picture, which is, I think in Western restaurants, I think it's very artistic. The chef does kind of like things last minute and always wants to change things. And maybe one day it's 5.5 prawns or 6 prawns, depending of the quality that's coming in. But once you have a picture, it better be 6 prawns, especially in Asia. You really have to make sure that it's exactly the same thing, or you will have things to explain.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I do find ordering from a picture easier, but didn't know the complications it involves on sourcing, on the chef, and all of that. I'm conscious of the time because we have about 13 minutes left, and I know there are many questions streaming in from chat box already, but let me just address one for the audience in total. What changes are you seeing with COVID-19 or post-COVID? Are you making changes in the business model or anyway?
Oh, gracious. I mean, it's such a tough time. I think for us, you know, we decided to open in the middle of February. We basically said, okay, we're open and we're going to stay open. We, of course, had to split the tables. We had to take out half the tables. So you immediately reduced the capacity by half. It's much, much quieter. It's beginning, I mean, Shanghai has been pretty secure, but, you know, people are nervous and they're not going out. They're not spending as much money. I think that for us, it's been interesting to see that afternoon tea and brunch is much more popular. And I think in the beginning of the COVID time, when people started to go out again, they felt they were going out at lunchtime and during the day, but not so much at night. It's now sort of picking up a bit. Of course, it's summer. We've had awful weather in Shanghai, and that very much affects, but, you know, that sort of makes it difficult as well. I mean, you know, if I think for anybody who's in a business, and if there's anybody in the restaurant business watching this, it's like, do not spend 1 penny you don't need to spend. Hang in there and make sure that the customers you've got are really treated like royalty. You know what I mean? You can't let your standards slip because things are difficult. You still have to, you know, have a good standard. And I think from a business point of view, from a, you know, business owner's point of view, one of the things, you know, that I think is that my job is really to keep my team motivated, because it was more difficult, much more difficult for them. I'm not there. You know, they've got to deal with it every day, and keeping them sort of upbeat and positive, and, you know, managing and making decisions on rosters. And that, you know, there's a lot of adjustment that's had to go on with financial, looking after money. Ignace, I guess it's,
Ignace.
I think similar. I think the morale of the team is very, very important. Making sure that everybody can stay motivated. I'm actually slightly surprised to see how it really impacts the team working on day-to-day basis. In terms of business, I think it kind of like depends from demographics. Young people, I have one restaurant in a kind of like in a young area. They seem to not really be so much affected. They still want to go out, spend, drink, enjoy as much as possible. I think maybe in a different demographic, a bit slightly more older, I think exactly as Michelle says, people are cautious, not so certain about what's going to happen, want to make sure that they can save money for whatever's going to happen. On my side, from a business side of the point, I started a delivery service, which is something I have never done in my entire life. So we decided to do delivery ourselves with my team, because with 5 restaurants, some definitely are also down in terms of revenue. And my biggest asset is the hospitality, is the team that we have. So I want to try to find a way to keep them employed, number one, and also find ways to keep them motivated. So we made a delivery app that's bilingual, and also actually we do the delivery ourselves with our own scooters. And I had no idea how difficult it is actually to find somebody's address, even though you have all the apps. So we've been having a lot of fun trying to figure out how to get a nice packaging, sustainable to people's houses. Logistics are quite a nightmare. So, but it's been fun. It's been giving us something exciting to try to do and keep us all motivated. So I think it's good.
I would ask, you know, all of us who are living in Beijing and Shanghai, if you have a chance, try out this delivery service and go to M for the brunch or afternoon tea. It's really crucial to support all these fantastic businesses through difficult times. And tell us how you like the packaging. Enjoy this.
Well, we're also doing delivery. Interesting. We're doing it through Erlama, which is one of the big platforms. It's been interesting to see what that's like. I mean, I was also really reluctant. I think so much of a restaurant experience is about being in the restaurant and having things there, not something arriving in. We had such a challenge to find all sustainable and no plastic. And it was that no plastic's impossible. All the lids of things are made from plastic. But we found, you know, recyclable containers and things. But yeah, it's sort of quite interesting, actually. I mean, it's not done much for a change in the turnover, really. But it's another option to have. I don't think that was a choice. I think everybody had to really, you know, you had to do whatever you could to survive through this tough time. And it's looking much longer than we all had hoped. That's the scary thing.
Yeah, indeed. Just hanging there. Okay, let's get to a few questions. Bright and Bleacher from YouTube asked, Ignace, did you have any difficulties with the modification renovation to the temples? Was the kitchen an issue?
Yes, the kitchen was definitely not easy. Well, the restaurant itself is not really in a temple, so it's a compound. Within this temple, there was an old factory, which actually later on turned into a kind of like a backpacking hotel. And this backpacking hotel had a license for food, similar to what Michelle was saying. So I was able to use this license, but there was no kitchen. So we actually had a big kitchen outside, far away from the temple, and go 2 stories down into the grounds, and then make the kitchen themselves over there. So took a little bit of time. Also, the difficulty with China is that you actually build a restaurant, and then afterwards you'll get the license. You physically build the restaurant, make the kitchen, and then you need to wait for somebody to approve it, which is a very, very difficult process if you come from the West. But it got approved, and we opened, and we're still there.
Wonderful. Okay, to Michelle, here's a question. I really enjoyed the community building and saloon style you created with the literary festival, book reading events, chamber music, and mentor walks. What motivated you to expand the range of offerings at your restaurants to these events?
I think in the beginning, you know, I've always been involved in community work and in not-for-profit work as well. So I felt in the beginning that we should do things that supported the community. If you want to be part of the community, I think you have to be part of it. And therefore you have to give into that community. I'm a big reader. You know, for me, it's been an enormous privilege coming up with that literary festival. Right at the beginning, we had empty space. Basically, we had the whole floor and we had empty space. And it was like, well, what are we going to do with it? And during the day, it wasn't open. So we thought, well, you know, let's do some events. So that sort of morphed from a few Irish poets reading to a couple of people playing some music. And I love chamber music also. So both of them are passions of mine. To actually a whole festival. The literary festival is an enormous amount of work. It's not a full-time job, really. The chamber music now, I don't have to do a lot. But, you know, it's still, you know, got to put it on. But it's an absolute joy to go to a small chamber music concert in a small room. And the mentor walks, Actually, it started, there was an American woman I met, and she actually mentioned this, that they do this once a year. And I thought, my God, that's such a brilliant idea. So it's a very simple idea, but it actually was quite a lot of work to get organized. But basically, we have a bank of mentors who walk once a month, and mentees sign up. And so you get one-off advice. It's just a one-off mentoring. I think it's very useful. It's only for women. I mean, we only do it for women. Yeah, but I think it's a very...
Yeah, it was great. I was actually one of the mentors for your Beijing
yeah,
event.
Exactly.
Before
I think it's great. So, and everybody enjoys it, and it's organizing it is the thing. But now we have quite a few groups, and it's actually happening in many places. I have friends in Australia who took it on, and they're doing it in 9 cities.
Wow.
Now they're doing it online. Yeah. So yeah, it's but we've kept going. Yeah. It's good.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Now, Ignace, there's a question for you. Any plans to go out of Beijing? Hulu will be up and coming online. This person said any chance for a second TRB? There is a TRB, Forbidden City, right? But tell us about what's next.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about another restaurant outside of Beijing at this moment. I think
Yunnan.
I think restaurant.
Dali and Yunnan. I will.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, hospitality, restaurant business, I think it's really all about hospitality and the people. So I think opening a restaurant actually is pretty easy. It's just putting some money on the table and bringing the people in. But bringing a soul to a restaurant, I think is very, very difficult. So I think at the stage right now, I would do it, but I would only do it if I really feel 100% convinced that I have the right people that be able to make it happen. I'm also not ready myself to jump on a plane and go to different cities. So I think I want to wait a little bit. Also, I've started in 2012, so it's only 8 years, and it's now 5 to 6 units. So I think it's a lot in a very short period. So I want to wait a little bit.
I don't blame you. And I can tell you that at one point I had 4 apartments. I lived between Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. And I nearly went crazy. We never did do anything in Guangzhou. Interesting city, Guangzhou. But it's a lot to run between cities, and you do, and people, and especially I think for Ignace and I, because we are associated with the restaurant. So people expect to see you. Ignace is much more committed than I am because he's there all the time. He never stops working. And I also work a lot, but I don't work on the floor anymore. Well, I can't anyway. I'm not in China right now, although hopefully I'll get there soon. Hopefully I'll be there in a few weeks. Yeah. So it's demanding.
Well, you guys both have done an amazing job. Let's just hang in there, and this COVID, this pandemic will pass, and you will have a great story to tell a year or 2 from now, right? Sadly, we have one question we probably will not be able to get to. Any last few words you want to call for action before I jump into talking about what's next in our conversation series?
Yes, I would. Can I take an opportunity to say something? I would really like to say, thank you, May, but I'd also really like to say there seems so much animosity at the moment. There's so much finger pointing, and I really just hope everybody everywhere can calm down and listen to other people. I have to say, being Australian, just listen to the other side. Everybody has a right to their opinion. So yeah, I think a little bit more listening needs to happen in the world. And, I know I shouldn't be political, but there you are.
I'm with you. Any last few words from you, Ignace?
No, first of all, also thank you so much for the opportunity. Actually, I think whatever happens, for me personally, whatever happens right now, actually, I think it's all somewhat good. It really gives a lot of time to reflect and to look at different opportunities. I think sometimes we all go so fast all the time, and to be forced to stop and to reevaluate personal choices and company choices, actually, I think is in a way, I think it's maybe a blessing. So actually, I'm somewhat positive about everything what's happening right now, and I think we'll all become more stronger and wiser and probably make better decisions. So that's how I feel.
Absolutely. And eating better and drinking better always helps.
Yes.
So thank you both for taking the time. And let me take this opportunity to tell you, if you're lucky, if you go to M on the Bund in the next couple of months and follow WildChina's WeChat account, you can get Michelle's Dragon's Pearl cocktail with your next meal. Right? And I will talk a little bit about our upcoming events. Next week, same time, we have Philip Tinari of UCCA at the gallery in Beijing. We'll talk about modern art, a little bit of history of modern art. So after eating and drinking, we have some intellectual journey with art, right? And end of the month, we will be reading a book by Lisa C. It is The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane. That goes all the way back to my home province of Yunnan. So do come back and join us. And thank you again, Michelle and Ignace. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And thanks everybody for joining. Have a wonderful day for those of you in Asia.
Thank you, May.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ignace. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.
Good luck with the business.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.